I want to welcome you all to being here tonight. It's a terrible weather and construction problems, and it's really nice to see you all. And this is the type of subject matter that we want to go back to. This was the founding strength of S.I.R.E, and it's the reason for our existence. And so I just want to reemphasize politely once again that we don't want to be known as a stock market chat group. We want to broaden our horizons and expand our vision to include all periodicity as we observe it. And now for our speaker of the evening. As Edgar Lawrence Smith postulated in the 1920s, and even William Shakespeare, are there tides in the affairs of men? You bet they are, according to tonight's speaker, who holds that change is not random, but encoded in the rhythms of life itself. David Katzmire is a true eclectic. He has studied and worked in such diverse fields as psychology, classical guitar, computer science, and building management. Through his own self-discovery and personal development, he has observed that an interrelationship of physical, emotional, and intellectual cycles function as a triumvirate braid of rhythms that predetermine highs and lows in any life cycle, from the minutest particle of nature to the nation state. In a preview of a forthcoming book, KalaRhythms, the Tao of Now and the Cycles of Change, he will view how developments in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 80s were fully supported by his theory and offer some fascinating predictions for the decade ahead simply by decoding the map of time. Are we heading into a worldwide depression, or does America's greatest days lie ahead? Why will the year 2009 be of significance? Why is a recession likely in the year 2020? For some thoughts, it's a real pleasure to introduce David Katzmire. Thank you.
For this meeting of the Society for the Investigation of Recurring Events. This is S.I.R.E, where we practice the age-old Lyceum principle of the one teaches the few, and the few teach the many. I'm David Katzmire, and the recurring events that we'll be looking at tonight are KalaRhythms, the cycles of change in America. How fractals in time and periodic chaos reveal key phenomena in the American experience. This book is based on my upcoming book, KalaRhythms, as was announced. Now, from time to time, I'll ask you to look in your book because we'll be referring to charts on the cycles of time. It began with the birth of our nation. The triad of rhythms in America began with the birth of the United States in the American Revolution of 1775. An internal system of three cycles has been moving like clockwork ever since. They correspond to the body, the heart, and the mind of a nation. A physical cycle brings change to our strength and our production. An emotional cycle changes our mood and aspirations. The intellectual cycle changes our ideas and our learning. Together, these changing energies bring changing times to the now of America. Because of mathematical precision, we can make a plot of rhythms that is more up to date than tomorrow's newspaper. It is a map of time. Now, the name of these cycles may sound familiar in that they are physical, emotional, and intellectual. The same aspect can be found in a nation. A nation is a collective of all the thoughts, feelings, and actions of everyone within the nation. That's why analogies have been drawn between a person and a state. German philosopher Oswald Spengler identified stages of civilization as having birth, youth, adolescence, maturity, senescence, and eventually death. With this, Spengler compared the life of a civilization to the life of a person. Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico concluded that stages through which Western civilizations had passed had counterparts in pre-Greco-Roman civilizations. With this, Vico said that civilizations are cyclical. Cycles of our lives, therefore, may give us clues to the passing of the ages. To accept the notion that transcending patterns recur between a person and a state is to conceive of a fractal. A fractal is that replicates itself in things great and small. In this case, the fractal is us. We are the fractal images of the civilizations we make up. So let's look at what is a fractal. Fractal rhythms are rhythms within rhythms. The name fractal comes from Bruno Mandelbrot, who discovered fractal geometry. Mandelbrot is a mathematician and IBM researcher who became fascinated with the study of self-repeating patterns. A shape that repeats its pattern is a fractal, and with this in mind, Mandelbrot developed a mathematical formula for plotting dots on a plane. It is a simple formula that produces shapes. What makes it a fractal is that it produces infinite self-similar patterns within patterns. One can zoom in on any part of the pattern with computer magnification to find intricate similarities on different scales. To zoom in far enough, you will go through a myriad of patterns that eventually reveal the shape that you started with. This is the Mandelbrot set. Now this was of striking interest to the scientific community because the Mandelbrot set mirrors nature around us, which is replete with fractals. Quartz crystals have molecules joined on 6 sides each by other molecules, hence the shape of the crystal is 6-sided. This is fractal geometry. The stages of growth within the lifetime of a being are similar to the stages of evolution in this line over millions of years. This is fractal development. Many moons orbit planets like Jupiter and Neptune, which themselves orbit the Sun, a process that some astronomers call mini solar systems within the solar system. This is fractal motion. We live in a universe of repeating patterns. Now, if fractals are within us and around us, and they repeat when fractals change through time, what is it about us that repeats when the pattern continues? Ka is ancient Egyptian for energy. Kala is Sanskrit for time. KalaRhythms are the changes of energy through time. The Egyptians believed that Ka is the physical, spiritual, and intellectual parts of a person or God that constitute an individuality. Transcends death of the body as living energy. Ancient Indian scriptures describe Kala as transcendent time and as relative time, which is cyclical in nature. We live in relative time and all the cycles within it. KalaRhythms are therefore changes in physical, spiritual, and intellectual energies through cyclical time. With that in mind, what is it that we can see in the United States and compare with the life of a person? Rise and fall in our industrial production is a multiple of the 7-year septennial rhythm of cell growth in our bodies. This is physical. Woman's menstrual cycle has an average length that coincides with phases of the moon every 28 days, and rises and falls in social tides of enthusiasm coincide as a multiple, while S.I.R.E cycles in the tilt of the moon's orbit around the Earth correlates to mood swings in our nation. This is emotional. Academic achievements and peak times of invention for our nation are a multiple of the 11-year sunspot cycle in electromagnetic radiation in solar wind. This is intellectual. We are not observers of nature. We are part of it. We're within the rhythms, and the rhythms are within us. We've been aware of rhythms for a long time. Consequently, you can find a chart that gives the times of coming ocean tides because they move in rhythm. You can list the next phases of the moon because it moves in rhythm. Now we can plot the times of change because our times change with rhythms as regular as ocean tides and phases of the moon. Seasons of time are changing dramatically now, and everything around us is changing with them. Periods of crisis and chaos also come as regular parts of the cycles. Now, for the first time, we can put our knowledge together and see the highs and lows and the times of chaos before they happen. They're encoded in the mathematics of life, encrypted in the American experience, and decoded here in the map of time. Now, if you'll turn to page 8 in your books, you'll see the generic pattern, true of all symmetrical cycles with periodicity. It's simply that half the cycle is high and half in the United States are periodic and symmetrical. The sine wave motion undulates between the forces of yin and yang, the duality of the universe. This changes our physical strengths in a 28-year physical cycle, where 14 of the years are high and 14 years are of low energy for the United States. During a high in our physical strength, we increase our construction, industry expands, the military is more ready, we play sports better, our health and fitness improves, and we're acrobatic in dance and other endeavors. For 14 low years, we lessen these energies. The high time of the 1970s and 80s, for instance, was a very physical trend. We had Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone as top box office draws in the movies. Everybody was working out, getting physical, rollerblading, and getting into the spirit. But after 1985, we became low. By the early 1990s, people were selling their exercise equipment, sports legends were not as revered as they were, and the industrial sector of our economy was in recession because our industrial base is physical. The 36-year emotional cycle comes with 18 years that are high and 18 years that are low. This changes our faith, our hopes, our dreams, how we worship, our idealism, our sense of romance, and the expression of the arts. For 18 low years, we lessen these energies and we are less enthusiastic. Just looking back over the last 100 years, we can recognize a pattern of highs and lows. We had the gay 90s in the latter part of the last century, which turned downward for a period of reform right after the turn of the century. We rose again to the roaring 20s, a heyday for America, that declined after that in the Great Depression when all of our cycles were low at once. We rose out of that into the fabulous 50s and the 60s with a peak in 1964. Then we came down again in the 80s and part of the 90s. Now we're approaching a new peak, which is due in the year 2000. During the 44-year intellectual cycle, 22 years are high and 22 are low. The high brings expansion to science, education, invention, commerce, literature, and finance. After that, we decline. In the 1960s, we were high when we elected John Kennedy, who was an intellectual from Massachusetts, and students peaked in their SAT scores 1 year after the intellectual cycle peaked. After that, it declined, and we had the so-called me generation and Generation X of apathy, attention deficit disorder, and lack of energy. These are the highs and lows in our cycles. If you turn to the next page, on page 9, you'll see how when a cycle passes from high to low, it goes through 4 stages of development. This is like the seasons in nature. When a cycle is building, it starts in the midpoint and rises towards a peak. This is the first quarter, a time of foundation. This is the spring of the cycle. You can make an analogy of the tree of life making blooms and sowing seeds for future times. This is when we build anew and set down foundations and precedents and establish what will set the course for many, many years. After we hit the peak, we come down in the most energetic time of the cycle. That's the second quarter of expansion, improvement, and variation. This is when we branch out on the foundations that we built. Everything comes to fruition. You can imagine a tree making its limbs as full as possible. This is when we become eclectic and we take variations of a theme as much as we can. The high ends and we go down into the low half. This is the third quarter of review or autumn, and you can imagine a tree losing its leaves for fall. This is when we regress and look back on what we've done when the cycle is high. We have reform of anything we look back and don't find favorable, and we have nostalgia for that which we find favorable. There's a time for looking forward and a time for looking back. The fall is a time of regression. The cycle bottoms out, and we rise up on the fourth quarter to begin anew. This is the winter. You can imagine the tree of life losing its dead wood. This is when we downsize, we seek alternatives, and we oust anything that is old. We have an abstract concept of what we want for things as we search for new things that will not take form until the next new cycle is high. And then the cycle continues. Now, whether you're following a cycle of 28 years, 36 years, or 44 years, or a cycle of a few months, if it is a true cycle, it is likely to follow the same stages of development. This is universal from cycle to cycle. When the cycle crosses from low to high or from high to low, it must go through the midpoint of transition to shift gears, as it were, as you go from high to low or vice versa. This is the crossover, the time of crisis in the cycle. It goes through the midpoint, and it will stay in crisis for 1 year in America, no matter which cycle it is. Now, if it's a physical cycle, it changes our strength in a crossover as it goes high or a crossover as it goes low. This will perhaps give us industrial recessions, strikes, or violence. And in just those three categories, if you look back over history, every single time the physical cycle has crossed over the midpoint of crisis, one of those things at least has happened. Every time. Emotional crossovers will cause panic or rioting or outrage, like the Rodney King beating, or strikes in Alabama when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. These are things that are emotional. In the intellectual cycle, when you have a crossover, you can have severe drops in the stock market, or you can have a historic shutdown of the federal government over philosophical disputes. These are ideological conflicts that will manifest when the people who have power are controlling a nation in crises. The basic pattern of highs and lows, 4 quarters of change, and critical points of crossover is the generic pattern for a cycle. Does anybody have any questions about the basic pattern of the cycle so far? Yes?
Does the cycle go in different countries, different ways?
Exactly. I believe that every country has the same KalaRhythms that we do. There's 28 years, 36 years, and 44 years for every nation. Take, for instance, Japan, that was on a high in the 1980s, is now in a low, and I believe in the winter of the cycles, a cleaning out period. Cleaning out that has followed the years of reform that has ousted some of their members in finance and political. I believe they're in the winter now in the majority of their cycles, and they're due for a rise, but not for another decade at least.
More than one cycle going on all the time.
I think that every nation has 3, mind, heart, and body. Yeah.
Do they ever converge so it so happens that all the 3 cycles are at the same time low?
That's a good question. There were 3 times in our history when 2 cycles crossed over at the same time. Now, we can have a recession or riots or a crisis because a cycle is crossing over. When you have 2 crossing over, it's more than twice as bad. And we're going to come to 3 examples in our history in just a little bit. 1901, 1929, and 1973 is when it's happened. And we can know when the next one is.
I noticed that this is a perfect analogy to biorhythms. Which
Yes.
I keep track of my biorhythms every day. What made you choose these numbers? Because we know we have the 23, the 28, the 33-day cycles. What
That's
made
right.
you choose these particular numbers?
Because of the elements I saw that first define the quarters, such as the septennial rhythm and cell development in our bodies. The 7-year cycle, as it were, has been known in many things for many years. When I looked at, is there a 7-year cycle in the United States, I found that there are, in a way, but nothing controlling the trends on a major scale for the nation. So I did multiples of it because of the fractal relationship and because of the self-replicating patterns that can be found in mathematical models, very simple, for complex things in nature. So I tried 14, didn't get much, got something. When I got up to 28, I found that no matter how far back I traced these, all the way back to the American Revolution, every 14 years there was a crisis, and for 14 years we were high, 14 years we were low. And it's holding true today. We're coming out of a low right now, and in Philadelphia recently we had a couple of buildings that fell down. They just fell because we're not keeping up our maintenance. We had bridges that had to be closed And I understand there's some things happening up here in New York as well, and across the nation.
Just across the street.
And just across the street, which is an advent of physical causality and not a reflection of the condition that the building is being kept in right now. It's an internal aberration, and there's nothing cyclical that I can explain for what happened on the scaffold. That's an aberration. But the last year, we've had about 10 buildings in New York alone fall from lack of repair. And that's because we're in a physical low.
Does everybody have different cycles?
No. Everyone in the theory of biorhythms has the same biorhythms of 23 days, 28 days, and 33 days. But we're all born on different days. So I could be in a high one way, you could be in a low, or vice versa.
Do your birth.
It's due your birth because it's like a clock from the day that you're born.
So if anything happens to, let's take a date, January 1st of the year, for all people born January 1st, 1998,
Right?
their cycle should be identical.
Identical. Exactly.
Where they are.
No matter where they are. Their internal rhythms will be at the same point. But their external events will be different.
Because I was just going to say, what about the environments that they live in? Does this affect their
Yes.
cycle?
So it's a combination of external and internal and the interplay between the two.
It's kind of scary.
Yes.
Until you know the math.
I mean, you go into a real crisis like the thing that we have, I guess, in Boston, New Guinea or something like that, with that tidal wave that came. I mean,
Yes.
People are going to die.
That's right.
Nothing you can do about it, really.
Nothing you can do about it. When there's an aberration like that or a drought like we had in the Midwest, these things can and will occur. But there are other types of crises that come when they're due. And it's based on the internal clockwork of our rhythms, whether it's the biorhythms of a person or the KalaRhythms of a nation. Alan, right back to you.
Yeah, maybe you could talk about something like how these rhythms are natural, and if we knew what they were, we wouldn't have to be building when it's time to take care of maintenance. There's something about knowing it that helps us in our own understanding of how to function in the world.
Exactly right. And I've seen this in the entertainment business where they would budget for a movie of a particular genre that's quite popular, and by the time it goes into production, the fad has passed. And when you're building, you're probably going to get a higher yield of productivity if you can do this during a physical high, because people are more kinetic when it's physically high. If you have a particular product that you want to launch, then where the emotional cycle is. Are people looking for new things, or are they reflecting back in the third quarter of the autumn, and they want to bring something from the past? You're a fashion designer, you should know. Go with the trends, go with the tides. You won't be swimming upstream to go in a straight line. The currents will get you there faster if you go with them. Yes?
Actually, the after.
There you go. Okay.
He was in my car.
It was a new tide. You must have been both born on a similar day. Now, if you look on page 10, talking about when you're born, the United States was born in the American Revolution of 1775, and you'll see a chart where all of our cycles begin at once and begin to rise. And as you can see, in a very short time, they start to separate and create a fugue, a three-part dance, if you will, that changes in a myriad of ways through time. Now, if you look on the next page, page 11, you'll see a chart of these three energies through time up until today.
Next, you want to question?
Yes, as many as you want.
What is death?
Death is the Soviet Union pulling down statues and disseminating. And the rhythms that were intact then are not likely to hold any means of predictability now.
So is there a rebirth starting?
Yeah. The cells live on, the individuals. We're like cells in a great organism. That's why we move as a collective whole. Now, it sounds a bit mystical, but the fact is the trends do change our stock market, and our styles of clothing are found in the same malls in the Southwest as they are in New Hampshire. And we gear up to things with a collective energy. So yeah, we have a life. We're a young nation, and one day we will die. But the people who make up the nation and their progeny will continue to make another one.
So when we die because?
Well, there's no such thing as death. There's only a change of form. But when a nation dies or a person dies, its energy only goes elsewhere. The Soviet Union died, but there are still living beings over there who are forming another CIS. And that will start a new clockwork of rhythms. which is totally dissynchronous to what was there.
You seem to be following Spengler pretty much.
I think Spengler had something to say there, and he was looking pretty much more at what you might call the phylogenetic development of a nation over time. And he was looking at how it matured and went through its stages of development from birth to death. But beyond that, I'm looking at how you might have the biorhythms of the United States within its lifetime. Now, you could call this the biorhythms of the United States,
Well, it looks like biorhythms.
which you did, and you're right. Yes, sir.
Can you explain why
Oh,
it's 1775 instead of 1776?
The American Revolution actually started with the birth pangs of an era when we broke away from our mother country of England. The fighting started in April in Concord, Massachusetts, and Lexington, and that was the first sign of birth, a very painful experience. We had our own army headed by George Washington. We had our own Navy in 1775. We had the First Continental Congress was formed. We even made our own conscript to pay the military. And we had our own flag. It bore the Cross of St. George, but it had the red and white stripes and the blue field in the upper left-hand corner. It was the first American flag, all in 1775. We were a nation alive and well, fighting for our independence. It's how you have to exist first before you can declare that you're existing. And we did that in the following July. Yes?
If all countries start like burst of something and they rise up,
Yes.
some don't succeed when they try with the burst of something.
That's true. You have to use up the yolk of the egg and survive in that first initial bit of energy to go on, because you're going to have a string of lows that follow before you can go through the myriad of patterns of highs and lows of your physical, emotional, and intellectual energy. Getting started is the hardest part. And we survived, and the fighting went on for quite a many years, and we've survived being born, and we survived starting up, and we survived fighting and continued. That's not an easy thing to do, and we went on to be a very strong nation. Yes, sir.
Have you done any research in going back in time to like the fall of nations, like for instance the Roman Empire, the Minoan culture?
Yes, sir. It's sketchy information on that I have, and what I've been able to conclude is that while every nation has its own rhythms of physical, emotional, intellectual energies, they're all under the umbrella of world change, a larger group of the same three cycles as a fractal replication, bringing about the slower eras of change. I believe that during the Dark Ages, as it were, all three of the cycles of change were low for the world. These are 12 times larger than the nations of the United States, the cycles of the United States. Now, they began to rise during the Renaissance, and the physical was the first one to peak. You can hear it in the Renaissance music, which is very rhythmic, and a lot of drums, and the magnificent buildings that came out of that time. We build more when the physical cycle is high. And the following one to peak and a three-way rise from the Renaissance was the intellectual cycle. And this was in the Baroque era, I think somewhere in the 1600s, when we had Bach and so forth. It was a very eclectic time when we expanded upon the precedents that were set just before. The clothing was very frilly. In fact, Baroque itself is French for an irregularly shaped egg. And that is the word we define the era with, because it was so elaborate and ornate. The buildings had not just columns to hold it up, but the Ionian scrolls that ornated it, and the ruffles on the clothes, and the music had mordents and trills in it, because everything was ornate. But it was all using the same precedents that had been set before. Bach invented nothing. He just took everything and ornated it to the fullest. He never invented a form of music.
How about
Right, Whitney?
equal temperament and the ability to modulate from one key to another?
Well, modulation is something that's more preferred during...
Position, by the way, so
I can take it. Modulation and counterpoint are the two things that I used to do classical guitar in Philadelphia. Counterpoint, having more than one voice, one melody line at a time, and modulation, which is changing keys, is more preferred during the intellectual high, because it becomes an exercise for the mind. Like a fugue, for instance. You're following the different melodies. You can sit back and just listen to the notes, and they're nice, but if you really listen, you can see that one line is repeating the other, which is repeating a third, like a three-part Bach fugue. And what you'll see here in the rhythms of time, the cycles themselves are replicating the same pattern and following it in different sequences of time, much like a Bach fugue. Yeah, John?
We're running a bit behind schedule. Maybe we could hold the questions.
Okay, I'm sorry. We stopped late. I want you... should I go on with the part here already? That got interesting. I'm sorry that we digressed here a little bit. But to cover the substance before Q&A, you'll be able to look at this later and see the cycles high and low and read it as if they were words. You'll be able to read it as a map of time and understand why they peaked high in the 20s, low in the 30s, in different times, and follow it throughout the ages. Now, if you turn to the next page, you'll see what combined highs and lows can do. As we began in the American Revolution, and I picked some of the more familiar examples, but you'll find that all of history will bear this out. The only time in our history that all three cycles peaked within a decade is during the 1920s. From 1919 to 1929, the intellectual, the physical, and the emotional cycles all peaked. We don't call that the Roaring Twenties for nothing. It was due to be high. From the day we were born, we were due to have a heyday in the 1920s. The only time in our history that all three cycles hit the trough within a 10-year period has a name. We call it the Great Depression. You'll see that the physical, the intellectual, and the emotional cycles all hit the bottom. And that was a terrible economic time. Now, it's interesting if you look at the emotional cycle, which was high during part of the Great Depression. Some of our greatest entertainment came out of the poorest times. When you look at what Hollywood was putting out, Gone with the Wind, and Shirley Temple, and The Wizard of Oz, George Gershwin was making very, very beautiful music. But that too crossed low during what was destined to be the lowest time in America. If you look at where we are now in the bottom diagram, you'll see that all three cycles in America are rising simultaneously, bringing us out of the low from which we come, bringing us out of the me generation, Generation X, ADD, and the recession of 1992, which was a trough of the physical cycle, by the way, a time when both Ford and GM had record losses ever for their corporations, and they're quintessentially physical institutions. That's highs and lows combined. If you turn to page 13, you'll see the answer to another question that came up. What happens when two cycles hit a time of crisis at once? In 1901, we found out for the first time. That's when President McKinley was shot by an anarchist, and Teddy Roosevelt succeeded to the presidency. The era of big business ended as huge trusts and monopolies lost control of all industries like copper, sugar, meat, tobacco, oil, and stock prices fell dramatically. It's now known as the Panic of 1901. History records that it threatened the entire banking industry of the United States. As an emergency response, there were reformist acts that were put into place by Roosevelt. These are the reform acts of third quarter, review, reform, and regression. And we had a double third quarter that followed when we reviewed the whole business world of our country. And it broke up some of the big ones. We called them the muckrakers and the trust busters. The second time, two cycles hit the critical point at the same time. It was in 1929. And I think we all know something about that. The emotional cycle peaked in 1928. Our enthusiasm was running very high. We were speculative buying. Everybody thought we had had the war to end all wars. We had bright outlooks for the future, and you couldn't lose. They used to say that not only could anybody make a profit, but they should make a profit in the market. Well, as we were 1 year from an emotional peak, an unprecedented physio-intellectual double downward crossover took the floor right out from our feet. And the rest, well, was history. And it happened one more time. 1973 was another double downward crossover which ended the 1960s. That's when the Watergate affair began, led to the resignation of President Nixon and his cabinet. And the economists now call this the recession of 1973 and 74. We had two successive quarters of very downward conditions. And it's also when the oil crisis began. That's a lot for 1 year, but not when you consider that it was due. Now that's a double crossover. Just take a look at the last three crossovers on the next page. We had 1985, 1991, and 1995 were the last three crossovers. In 85, that brought the end of our yuppie era of materialism and business expansion, and the United States became a debtor nation for the first time since World War I. This was the beginning of our decline. Land values fell. We went on to have savings and loan failures, and industry cut back. 1991-92 was a crossover year also, but a crossover of a different sort. This wasn't physical. This was emotional. That was when Rodney King was beaten. It just happened to be caught on videotape. It was shown across. We've seen the hideous acts of racism and violence before, but this particular one came at a time when we were in a state of agitation, and none of us will ever forget it. I certainly won't. So, after the acquittal, which surprised me, everybody started rioting. There were riots in Las Vegas that you may not have heard about because they were successful in suppressing in the news, but there were fires and riots across the nation. Also, in this year, Clarence Thomas was going through his hearings. William Kennedy Smith was on trial, and boxer Mike Tyson was convicted for rape. The last crossover, 1995, an upward crossover of the intellectual cycle. This is not physical. It's going to affect land values as much. It's not emotional. That's going to create moral outrage in writing. This is conceptual. It's intellectual. And what happened? Historic shutdown of the federal government over philosophical disputes. We also had some other things. The greenbacks went into a downward spiral as the U.S. dollar reached a post-war low of 80.15 yen. The Dow Jones plummeted 171 points on Friday, March 8, which is March 8, 1996, which is within the crossover. A crossover year lasts from March 21 to March 21 of the following year. That was the third largest point drop in our history. We lost $186 billion in stock values. A crossover is a serious thing. Now, before we run out of time, I want to take you through a quick glance at the decades leading to now, starting in the 1950s. I figured I'd use our lifetime because that's more familiar. We could do this for any decade. Let's take things that we might remember. If you look on page 15, at the top of the page is a diagram of the universal pattern of a cycle. That is for quick reference. It shows where the crossover is, the first quarter of setting foundations, a peak, second quarter of making variation and improvements, downward crossover crisis, third quarter review, regression and reform, the trough, fourth quarter rising, and an upward crossover. Now, if you look on your chart for the 1950s, you'll see that it was a physically high time. From 1955 to 1957, we had the greatest economic expansion not only for our nation, but for any nation in any time. If you look on your charts, you'll see for that period, we briefly had a three-way high in the cycles. The only three-way high we've had since the Roaring '20s. Later, you may want to look through here in your books, and you'll see what the physical high and the quarters have done in change and development. Let's go on to the 1960s. The 1960s, on the next page, page 16, shows how we had an emotional peak and an intellectual peak in the same decade. This is when we had the free love movement, the free speech. The Beatles came to America with quite a ruckus. Eastern religions became popular on college campuses, and the intellectuals high brought opening of new art galleries and museums, and our SAT scores peaked, and psychology became a fad. We were more concerned with the content of a person's character and their mind than what their physical condition was. In fact, the hippies deliberately wore torn and tattered clothing, picking up on the beatniks of the late 50s, so as not to be judged by their appearance. We were in a physical low. It's sort of like the grunge look of today. And in the physical low, we lost the war in Vietnam. We failed in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion. We were weak physically, but our minds and our emotions were high. The good economy continued because we had such a three-way high in the 50s, but that too would decline after 1973 and the double downward crossover of those cycles. If you turn the page and look quickly at the 1970s, You'll see that that low physical cycle, the blue line, crossed up into the high in 1971, of course with a crisis, and some 200,000 anti-war protesters marched on Washington, and we had a horrendous prison riot at Attica. GM also had a wildcat strike. That became the physical time, overshadowing the emotional and the intellectual energies that were marking the times of the 60s. Those energies continued to decline, and we got more and more physical. Industry expanded, we became materialistic, and the yuppies were born. Turn the page again. 1980s. Physical high continued. Reagan became popular on a large segment of the nation for expanding the military. In fact, his expansion was called Star Wars. It was so extensive. It was time to build up the military. But the times were very much unromantic and not very conducive towards intellectualism in the general populace. You'll find on these pages examples of how we were in decline. And to bring us up to now, look at the 1990s on the following page, page 19. You'll see a triad of cycles in the fourth quarter. That's when it goes from the bottom up to the middle point. One winter after another when we seek alternatives. We are searching for new things. We are abandoning the past. We are simplifying. That's why the incumbents in Congress lost the elections in 1994. The most popular candidate was other. If the Republicans had been the majority, they probably would have lost. The Democrats were in, and they're ousted. George Bush was in, he was ousted. Now, the reason why I believe that President Clinton won is because we're coming out of a fourth quarter period of winter, and we're crossing into the high half. He used emotional appeal. His message was hope for tomorrow. George Bush's appeal was his successes in the past and his military achievements that had little appeal and a physical low. Hope for the future was a greater sell. Not endorsing any candidate. I'm looking at their strategies and what is popular. And finally, on page 20, you'll find that there are examples of how all three cycles work together on something in particular. You'll be able to see how the recession of 1991 was a result of the emotional crossover, which caused panic, just before a physical trough in 1992, bringing industrial weakness, and we couldn't think our way out of it during the intellectual low. Second example is the midterm elections in 1994, because the cycles were in fourth quarter alternatives. And the third example is the O.J. Simpson case, with a verdict that was rendered in the intellectual crossover in 1995. It's a crisis of decision. It was based on emotion, an emotional high, and it shook up the judicial system. And at a time of physical low, we're finding it hard to enforce the law or enact capital punishment in states across the land. Enforcement is lessened when the physical cycle is low. Capital punishment historically has been approved during physical highs in our history. So that is a quick walkthrough of the triad of rhythms in America. But if there's one message I would have, it would be to look at what these cycles are, how history bears them out, and plot them to see where our courses will take us in the future. John, shall we do Q&A?
Yes.
Okay, well, does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir. Beg pardon?
How do we plan?
Let's see. I've got, in the back of the book, which I didn't discuss, is a forecast of the next 50 years in America and where the cycles are. The quarters of development are highlighted with numbers, and there's a paragraph per decade giving a forecast based on exactly where the cycles are. These forecasts were deliberated after looking at historic examples of when a cycle was in a similar position, or a combination of cycles was in a similar position. And you'll find that on pages 25 and 26.
Say somebody throws an atomic bomb or something like that.
Exactly.
In between cycles somewhere.
Exactly.
And when you start all over, is that what happens?
Only if the nation is wiped out. That's right.
I'm just trying to understand.
Well, that's what I call an aberration. It can, and whether it's an atomic bomb or not, something will happen to shake us up. If it's not an atomic bomb, it'll be a natural disaster. And unless the nation, its government folds, its economy collapses, and most of the people are depopulated or they give up on the system of government, the rhythms will continue until the nation dies. But an example of that is the Soviet Union. But there have been times when natural disasters have pretty much wiped out a colony. But now our states are so large, it takes, one region can suffer difficulty and survive because of the strength of the other regions.
Yes, you have a very elegant and very interesting model. Has there been any exception to the cyclical development of
The classic conflict is the world of physical causality versus the clockwork of rhythms. And the preponderance of the evidence has been that the majority of our significant events in America have been consistent with our internal rhythms. You can find in times that there are aberrations, like the California gold rush happened when it was not an emotional high, but it was very, very brief. What I found is that whenever you have an aberration in the response of a collective people, and it is not consistent with the cycles, it'll be very brief. We will go back to the river's course. And to know the difference between an aberration, which will be short-lived, and then the river's course of change, which will be long-term, is to know the cycles of change. An example of that was the 1987 drop in the market for over 500 points. There was nothing due in our cycles for that. And in fact, we recovered so much that by the end of the year, we were actually up a couple of points. Now, when I saw that happen, I knew that it wouldn't last. Well, I believed that it wouldn't last, and in fact, it didn't. If I had seen that in 1973, and if I knew this, what I knew in 1973, I would know that was the beginning of a long, dark night for America. And if I had this in 1928, I would have sold everything I had and kept the money. Yes, sir, I'll be right with you.
You mentioned there's a longer cycle of 12 times the average.
I believe so. I believe the physical cycle of the world is 336 years, the emotional cycle of the world is 432 years, and the intellectual cycle of the world is 528 years. I don't know. I'm hoping that if I pinpoint the exact point where they are in the phase, that I can find them all back to a certain point over the millenniums that will have a triple upward crossover where they all begin. And that might be an interesting thing. Maybe an avatar, an incarnation of God would be right with the aliens.
If you don't know where it started, how do you calculate what the length is?
That's why I'm having a little difficulty now with the phase shifting of these three cycles. I've been able to find that these highs and lows coincide, but I want to get them to the exact year for the world. In the case of the United States, it was quite simple. The American Revolution was the birth of our nation. There was no United States before then. And in some nations, like England, it is very difficult to find a beginning, and Japan is another one. So you look at where they are, and you phase shift them, and when you get those right, you can count back to the beginning. John?
Yeah. George Lindsay was a frequent contributor to S.I.R.E. and had some very, very accurate cycle counts. In his cycle work, he counted the beginning of this country at the War of 1812 when Washington was burned. Have you tried that? And how would that affect?
I've tried more than one beginning for the United States as an arbitrary measure. For example, I tried July 4th, 1776. And I followed stock market indicators. I got very interested in advanced decline lines, new highs, new lows, the put-call ratio, and so forth. And I was using the Joe Granville method of 10-day, 20-day moving averages and so forth with the advanced declines on that. What I found is that I was wrong every day, and every week, and every month. But I was wrong by about 16 months. When I took these charts and overlaid them, I phased them back until they lined up. And to do that was to have the starting point back in March of 1775, when the American Revolution began in April. The natural year is in March. But about 1812 is when we were very agitated and susceptible to war because it was an upward emotional crossover. From March 21 of 1811 to March 21, 1812, we were agitated in our emotions, and history now records that Congress was filled with war hawks, very eager to go to war with England, and sure enough, we did. So we were just in a bad mood. Yes.
It seems like if you
Okay,
take
last
something
one.
like the Soviet Union that has a definite starting point, which is probably when the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar, and a definite ending when, I guess, Gorbachev stepped down,
Yeah.
and that's like one whole life. And
That could be.
to chart that, but you might have to include the world current as, I mean, it just seems like that is a key factor.
As rhythms within rhythms. Know where the small cycles are in the context of the larger ones, and you've got to dance.
I'd like to bring the formal part of the meeting to a close. I'd certainly like to thank you, David, once again for a marvelous presentation. Your handout is absolutely superb, and I think we would all agree that we invite David back for at least part 2 and maybe part 3 to continue this discussion at a later date. I'd like to also recognize Ann Jerry for all her work for S.I.R.E, and great thanks to you, and Kathy Harrington.